I had a couple things I wanted to say about 9/11. The first thing I wanted to do was talk a little bit about something for those who are old enough to remember 9/11 as adults. And it seems so recent to me. It's very hard to accept that it's 20 years ago. But in any case, for those who are old enough to remember it as adults, there was a shocking pattern that emerged in the immediate aftermath of the attacks. And as I remember it, and it's a little bit hard to document actually, but as I remember it, the fact of the attacks caused a system, a very sophisticated system of journalism and all, that had been captured and had become corrupt and feeble and unable to do the most basic jobs that journalism, for example, does. That system suddenly didn't know what to do and started doing actual journalism, it seemed almost by accident. So this very slick product that was produced that, we were told was the news on any given day, actually emerged as a real phenomenon briefly in the aftermath of the attacks. And I think it was actually connected. The attacks happened and they were such a profound shock to the system that actually ads were taken off of television. Mm-hmm. It was understood that it was unseemly and out of place to have ads. And so suddenly what you effectively had was everybody drafted into a kind of, public broadcasting milieu. Suddenly people who were reporters doing whatever corporate wanted them to report, they were all in the same story. They had their microphones in hand. The cameras were right there already. And they did journalism because it was the obvious thing to do. Right. Mm-hmm. And it was so different from normal, right? You don't realize how abnormal things are under normal circumstances, or how at odds the narrative is from what's actually taking place, until an event like this causes people to suddenly wake up and start doing this job. And then I remember, this went on for some time. My recollection is a couple weeks.
I would have said a little less than a week. I don't remember.
But in any case, at some point, the ads returned, and normalcy returned, and the narrative control.
And the skies filled again, right? It was something, I would have said, a weekish, where there were no planes in the sky and there were no ads on the television. And when you walked out into the street, it both seemed quiet and, for many of us anyway, more open. And of course, there were many people who were immediately targeted. So it was a less open time for some people immediately after 9/11. But many of us found an ability to reach across gaps that we hadn't seen before.
Yes. I want to point to the last chapter, which we talked about last week, because at some level...
The penultimate chapter.
The penultimate chapter, yes, the last chapter we discussed, the penultimate chapter of our book, which talks about culture and consciousness and about the moment at which we shift modes, when we realize that something is not accounted for in our software and that we have to bootstrap new routines in order to figure out how to move forward. And this was it's really, I think, the clearest example of this in our lifetimes that we've experienced. That 9/11 was so far outside of our normal experience that suddenly we all kind of woke up and we saw each other for the first time. The camaraderie that was evident everywhere, as people who ordinarily might not have even spoken to each other suddenly had the very same topic on their minds, and it was impossible for them not to interact. It was as terrible as the event was, it was a very healthy response for a time. And then whatever it is that happens doesn't recognize this as a positive change and an opportunity, or it does recognize it as an opportunity, but as a different sort of opportunity. And we ended up, in the aftermath of 9/11 as polarized as we've been, really. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to just call that out, because having lived through it, and then I can't remember the last person I've heard mention that odd period where there were no ads on television, for example, right? It's a very important fact from the perspective of how it felt to be, right? But it somehow hasn't been recorded as an important part of the event, the way, the falling man or the crash in Pennsylvania or any of these other things were, right? But in some ways, it is an important story about how this got integrated into our fabric. And obviously, the world is not the same world that we lived in prior to 9/11 in many ways. I mean, some of them structural, some of them cognitive, but it changed the world. And it's a pity that we, at least in our common narrative of what happened, haven't captured that aspect of it. I also wanted to read something that I wrote actually in the aftermath of the terrorist attack in France in 2015, right? So this is actually a couple of years before you and I emerged into the public eye. I wrote something in the immediate aftermath of that attack and submitted it to Salon, which at the time was still a publication one could read. And anyway, to my surprise, they immediately accepted it and published it. And anyway,
then Common Dreams picked it up. Is that right?
And then Common Dreams rebroadcast it. And anyway, I thought part of it was important. And so anyway, I'm gonna take a read, and we'll put the link. It's still up on the web, and I'll put the link in the description. Yeah, you want to show the article? So as always, the title is not chosen by the author of the article, but it's "Let's Not Get This Wrong This Time. The Terrorists Won After 9/11 Because We Chose to Invade Iraq and Shred Our Constitution." All right. I'm going to start a paragraph in. Terrorism is a tactic in which the primary objective is to produce fear rather than direct harm. Terrorist attacks are, first and foremost, psychological operations designed to alter behavior amongst the terrorized in a way that the actors believe will serve them. The 9/11 perpetrators killed about 3,000 people and did about $13 billion in physical damage to the United States. That's a lot of harm in absolute terms, but not relative to a nation of 300 million people with a GDP of almost $15 trillion. It was a massive blow to many families and to New York City, but to the nation as a whole, that level of damage was about as dangerous as a bee sting. You may find that analogy suspect because bee stings are deadly to those with an allergy. But what kills people is not the sting itself. It is their own massive overreaction to an otherwise tiny threat that fatally disrupts the functioning systems of the body. And that is exactly what terrorists hope to trigger, a muscular and reflexive response on the part of the victim state that advances the perpetrator's interests far beyond their own capacity to advance them. The 9/11 attack was symbolic. It was not designed to cripple us economically or militarily, at least not directly. It was designed to provoke a reaction. The reaction cost more than 6,000 American lives in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and more than $3 trillion in U.S. treasure. The reaction also caused the United States to cripple its own constitution and radicalize the Muslim world in a reign of terror that has killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi and Afghani civilians. The return on the terrorist investment was spectacular. Assuming the official story is right, then Al-Qaeda got $7 million of effect for every dollar it spent on the attack. $7 million to 1. The ratio of harm inflicted on the U.S. targets by the 9/11 attacks to the financial harm the U.S. inflicted on itself reflects the same amplification. For every $1 of damage they did to us, we did $231 to ourselves. For every American that was killed in the attack, we sacrificed more than 2 on the battlefield. And that is all before we consider the instability we brought to the Middle East, the harm we did to our own freedoms, and the spectacular cost to our reputation abroad. In any case,
it's extraordinary and so prescient in unrelated realms today.
Right. And this actually is one of the reasons I wanted to read that, is because the idea that there are 2 things in play. There's the threat that you face, which is obviously real. And then there's the question of whether your reaction successfully diminishes the harm. Does it amplify the harm? And this is something that we always have to keep in mind. And as you point out, at this moment, we're not dealing with terrorism, we're dealing with other things, but the same question looms in a slightly different way, which is, what is the best reaction to this? And what are the chances that in an effort to fix our system, we will actually do more harm to it, and possibly harm we can't undo?